the exec I made the executive decision. There were a number of questions about kinship care from last week's teleecho, or 2 weeks ago. And so I wanted to take a couple of minutes and just talk a little bit about kinship care as well. I'm just trying to get my screen looking right. So apologies for 1 second. But I'm not sure I can, so I may just have to deal with it. Sorry. Okay, so I have no relevant financial disclosures. Please do interrupt me at any point. By way of quick introduction, I'm Liz Wallace. I'm a faculty at MUSC in pediatrics and psychiatry, and I direct the foster care support clinic at MUSC. So like I said, briefly, a little bit of background on kinship foster care. So kinship foster care is different than traditional foster care, in which children reside with a kinship caregiver, so generally a relative, though it does not actually have to be a relative. In South Carolina, those are referred to as fictive kin. So it could be, you know, a lady from church or a neighbor down the street or things like that. Nationally, 1 in 11 children reside in kinship care, which was a huge number to me that I did not realize. And there are approximately 54,000 children in South Carolina who live in kinship placement. And interestingly, South Carolina is the 5th state nationally with the 5th highest rate of kinship care placement. Actually, all of the top 5 are states in the Southeast. And as you might imagine, grandparents are the largest group of kinship caregivers, and they represent more than half of all kinship caregivers nationally. And the graphic below is from the Annie Casey Foundation, and just gives you a little bit of background of what the national spectrum of kinship caregivers look like. So, you know, they are disproportionately African-American. Almost 2/3 are under the age of 60. More than a quarter live in poverty. More than 30% live with a disability. So it's generally, it may be a somewhat vulnerable population when you think about the population of kinship caregivers nationally. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about kinship care in South Carolina, but I want to give a couple of definitions. So nationally, you can have formal or informal kinship care. Formal kinship care involves the court or legal documentation. Informal obviously does not. And then you can have public or private kinship care. So what we're going to be primarily focusing on is public formal kinship care, which is involving South Carolina DSS and sort of relevant court and legal documentation. And an example of that would be something like a non-court ordered safety placement or safety plan for a child. And typically what occurs in South Carolina with DSS custody is, as part of the investigation and evaluation when a DSS report is made, is one of the outcomes of that may be a safety plan. And what that safety plan will do will potentially name a kinship caregiver. They do lots of other things, so it may not, but one of the things it can do is name a kinship caregiver. And then if that's the case, and the child is to reside with the kinship caregiver, that will eventually be, the focus is generally on reunification. And so there'll be some sort of parenting plan that will be put in place, which is typically the work that the parent would need to do in order to regain custody of the child. And then the outcome of that would either be reunification or permanent legal guardianship by the kinship caregiver. There is a pathway to adoption potentially as well. In that case, there has to be termination of parental rights. And so more often than not, if it's a permanent kinship caregiving situation, it results in permanent legal guardianship rather than adoption. And one of the important things to know is that once children are, kinship caregivers are awarded guardianship of a child, they will likely not have ongoing South Carolina DSS involvement. So they lose the support of that caseworker once there's permanent legal guardianship. And then also important to know is that a parent can petition the court for that child to be returned at any time. So there can be a lot of uncertainty associated with that, as well as, you know, kinship caregiver may not know how to navigate the system if a parent is petitioning for a child to be returned. Also important and different than foster care is that cases can be completed without ever going to court. So DSS can award physical but not legal custody of a child to a kinship caregiver. And so it can occur without ever going to court, unlike traditional foster care, in which there would typically be, a merits hearing or sort of permanency planning, things like that, that would go through the court system. And I should say too, if I say anything incorrect, anyone from DSS, please jump in and correct me. So another important difference that I did not know when I started doing this work, but I think is really important to know, is that kinship caregivers, the children in kinship care are not eligible necessarily for the same benefits as children who are in traditional foster care. And so for kinship caregivers to be eligible for monthly board payments, so some like monetary support for caring for a child, for automatic Medicaid eligibility, for childcare vouchers, for training, case management support, they have to be licensed as a foster parent. Now that doesn't mean that if they meet income requirements for Medicaid anyway, the child may be eligible, but there's not the guaranteed eligibility that there is for youth in foster care. They are eligible for TANF, or temporary assistance for needy families, and SNAP, also known as food stamp benefits, without being a licensed foster parent, but they have to meet the state eligibility requirements. And then also, and this is a relatively recent addition in terms of, and I think our speaker from the kinship group at DSS mentioned this last time, but kinship caregivers are required to be notified by DSS about the process to become a licensed foster parent, because they can have that child in their home and become a licensed foster parent, and then they become eligible for the benefits that they would have if it was a more traditional foster care placement. So they may be eligible for more support. And then a couple of documents to know, because I know this came up when we were talking about, consent to treat and things like that. So one of the most common documents that you may see from a kinship caregiver is a safety plan. And so this is a voluntary written agreement. It's signed by parents, the kinship caregiver, and DSS. It is not a court order, but it outlines what each party agrees to do to keep a child safe. A kinship care agreement is a little bit different. This is more a document that explains the roles and responsibilities of a kinship caregiver, as well as parents and DSS. So it may include things like taking them to medical or behavioral health appointments, things like that. And then in order to be a kinship caregiver, you do have to meet certain eligibility requirements. So there is a home visit, and there is a background check, which includes criminal, sex offender registry, and child protective services records for not only the kinship caregiver, but for anyone in the house who is 18 or older. And that comes as an affidavit. So kinship caregivers will have to complete that information before a child can be placed with them. But it's obviously not as long as the licensing process to be a formal foster parent. Just a couple of other points that I think are relevant to the work that we do. Only if a kinship caregiver has legal guardianship can they obtain a birth certificate. So it can be difficult for them to do things for which they need a birth certificate, like get a driver's license or get a passport, or be able to work, if a child is a young adult or an adolescent, be able to work. They can enroll a child in school, provided the adult supplies an affidavit confirming the child's residency in the district and that the adult accepts responsibility for the child's educational decisions. So that means things like attending parent-teacher conferences and other things that would be related to the child's educational outcomes. And then lastly, South Carolina has a Medical Consent Act, which allows a legal custodian to authorize a child's medical, dental, or mental health care, as well as access records, including insurance records. This can be a fairly informal document. So it may be something that the parent and the kinship caregiver draft that includes, a statement with the child's information, date of birth, et cetera, the identity of the parent who's consenting, a description of what medical treatment is potentially authorized, and then it does not need to be notarized. It just needs to be signed by two witnesses, one of whom is not the sort of surrogate or the kinship caregiver, the decision maker. Some of these may be time limited, so you could write it for 6 months or a year, or you could write it indefinitely. And then this is also the act that covers clinicians or facilities who are acting in good faith to consent for a minor's treatment. So if you have a child who comes into the emergency department and the consenting agent can't be found, and there's the child has an appendicitis and needs an appendectomy, this is also the act that allows for someone to consent in lieu of a caregiver. Okay, So that's my quick overview of kinship care. And now we're going to switch gears and talk about the after visit summary. Okay. So there's only so much I can say about an after visit summary, but I did want to talk a little bit about the information that DSS needs, not only to take good care of the child, but also to make sure that the child's needs are being met. So there are a number of metrics that came out of the Michelle H. lawsuit, which we talked about earlier in the Learning Collaborative, that DSS is working hard to meet. And one of those is that, and I won't go through the exact percentages, but basically the majority of children will get an initial medical screen within 48 hours of entering care. And then within 30 days of entering care, children will receive a comprehensive medical assessment, a comprehensive behavioral health assessment, and a developmental assessment for children who are under 36 months of age. And then lastly, some sort of dental examination within 60 days of entering care. And I think, one of the things in doing this work that I have learned is that it can be very time consuming and at times like annoying to try to get all of this information communicated to the right people, especially if there's a lot of parties involved. But I do really think that communicating the outcomes of these assessments is one of our most important ways that we can advocate for these vulnerable children, because we can make all the recommendations in the world, but if the responsible party isn't aware of them and isn't able to follow through, you're sort of screaming into the void, which is not a particularly enjoyable place to be for anybody, and is certainly not what's in the best interest of a child. So the other thing to know, and again, I know we've covered some of these topics, but children in foster care should be receiving periodic preventative care in accordance with AAP guidelines. And that is information that's very important for DSS to have access to. So in addition to knowing that these children are getting well visits, it's also having access to results of hearing and vision screens, immunization records, developmental screening, lab screening as relevant. So, hemoglobin, lead, things like that. And then they are tracking a number of metrics as it relates to follow-up care. So, and I just gave a couple of examples, but there are a number of things, and these map pretty well for those of you that are following PCMH metrics in your practice. These are not exactly the same, but they map awfully well to a lot of the same metrics. So things like periodic asthma follow-up, making sure that patients who have mild, persistent, or worse asthma are on preventative medications, or controller medications, monitoring high-risk psychotropic medicine, so things like second-generation atypicals, and monitoring lipids and hemoglobin A1C, monitoring sort of initial stimulant prescribing and follow-up for ADHD. And there are lots and lots of others, but DSS is tracking all of these metrics in order to make sure that the majority of children are receiving this care in a timely fashion and having their health needs met. So thanks to Julia Powell, who is from Select Health, who I stole a couple of these slides from. But these, per South Carolina DSS and Select Health, these were the elements of the AVS, or the after visit summary, that they felt were critical. And I won't read through all of them, but basically they include, relevant health information, medicine and allergies, immunizations, screening tests that are done, and recommendations, basically. So making sure that they're getting the relevant recommendations in terms of follow-up care for these patients. So this is an example of what we created in the foster care clinic. So for a long time, we were getting multiple forms from multiple different agencies. So for example, the therapeutic foster agency would have a slightly different form than the DSS form, who would have a slightly different form than another therapeutic agency, who would have a slightly different form from, say, DJJ. And we found we were spending a lot of time handwriting these forms that was not sort of in anybody's best interest. And so we created a dot phrase. We use Epic, and I realize that many smaller practices do not have access to Epic, but they do have some kind of electronic health record. So we, and by we I mean Tracy, created an after visit summary that basically summarized all the information that was in the previous slide, as well as any information that was being asked for by any of the other agencies. So basically that the information would be covered regardless of the party that was asking for the information. And the majority of these in our electronic medical record auto-populate. So I've taken out the auto-populating codes because it was hard to get on one page otherwise. But the majority of this information auto-populates. So immunizations, problem lists, vital signs, allergies, all auto-populate. And then, you just have to go and fill in the blanks for hearing and vision and hemoglobin and lead, or, you can delete them if it's not relevant. Medications auto-populate, diagnoses auto-populate, and then we fill in the recommendations. And typically, we'll cut and paste from our Epic note or, what we're writing in our documentation and put those recommendations in layperson terms as much as possible, so that it's very clear as to what the recommendations are. And here's an example of what that looks like. And I'm sorry it didn't come across quite as well as I was hoping, of what it looks like for a patient. And I've obviously blacked out identifying information. And so this is very quick for us to generate. So as you can see, it sort of shows them if it's a new visit or a follow-up visit, and sort of goes through a summary of the visit. So an updated immunization record, updated problem list, vital signs for that clinic day, what assessments were completed. So this was an ADHD follow-up visit. So we didn't do things like hearing and vision and hemoglobin and lead, and it wasn't applicable because the child was 8, so we didn't need a lead level. This is just page 2. Screening, other screening that we did, outpatient medications, diagnoses, and what the recommendations were. So in this case, I was switching a kid from Concerta to Adderall because he had been up to 54 and had side effects, so but was not controlled at 36. So was switching him from Concerta to Adderall, and so wrote out those recommendations and sort of the follow-up instructions, and then to follow up in a month. So that's how we do ours. You certainly don't have to do it our way. And I realize that for many people, Epic is not the system that they're using. We are certainly happy to share our dot phrase with anyone who is using Epic. It should translate if we send it as a Word document. You should be able to plug it in. And then this is what the DSS form looks like. So again, this is another way of doing this process, is really going through the summary of the encounter. So the same information is there, you just have to handwrite it. And so for many of us, that takes a little bit longer. And so I'd rather have something that I can kind of auto-populate as much as possible. And then lastly, I want to talk about communicating information, because again, I think this is one of the challenges at times for us, for us to sort of gather the information and get it in sort of a summary format, and then getting it to the right people. And so, we provide the after visit summary to a number of people. We give it to the foster parent or the caregiver who's at the appointment. And while they don't have access to a child's full medical record, they do need the outcomes of a visit in order to know how to best care for that child, as they're the ones that's going to be administering medicine, or calling in to say what the medicine is doing, or if they're having any problems, et cetera. And then typically we provide it to somebody at DSS. Used to be the caseworker. It's more recently become the regional nurses, which I'll talk about. And then for patients who are in therapeutic foster care, oftentimes the therapeutic caseworker will ask for a copy of the AVS as well. And then we transmit this information in 2 ways. One is in person. So whoever's at the appointment, we give them an AVS or 2 or 3, however many people are there. And then the remainder that what we do is we transmit them electronically through Box. I do think there are a number of pitfalls to be mindful of. Probably the most important is the first, which is maintaining confidentiality for adolescents. So things like comprehensive, STI testing or access to contraception, things like that. We are very careful about the information that we provide. We certainly encourage teens to be upfront with DSS caseworkers and staff. And if there's an imminent concern, we certainly will break confidentiality if we have to. But it is important for these adolescents to be able to have some confidentiality. And so if they don't want some of this information relayed, we don't necessarily include it on the after visit summary. And then, the other pitfalls I will say, and I'm guilty of this, of forgetting to do the letter at the end of the visit. So the information is not provided by the clinician. And then I think one of our big frustrations, although I think we've worked through a lot of the kinks, is that the information doesn't reach the recipient, or the information is not read or not understood by the recipient. So we try as hard as we can to use as sort of lay terminology as possible, remembering that not everybody speaks, doctorese. So quickly, the best way to communicate the after visit summary information at this point is to go through the regional nurse coordinator. And these are the fax and email addresses for each of the 4 regions. As you can see, these are generic emails. So if the nurse changes, the email should still be the same. And these are the folks that if you are able to communicate that AVS directly to DSS is probably the best and easiest place to do it. And their job is to get that information into the case file and get the caseworker updated in the event that the caseworker is not present at the visit. And the idea is that there's many fewer of them and a sort of centralized place for us to be able to reach out and provide this information, as well as a party that has some medical background and so can hopefully understand the recommendations if there are questions or concerns. So in summary, I think the way that we have tried to streamline this as much as possible is we've sort of got an organized pre-populated summary that we generate at the time of the appointment. We tried, doing it after the appointment, or you end up tracking, chasing down too much paperwork, and it becomes very time consuming. Your summary, like I said, should include any of the EPSDT metrics, relevant care, medications, allergies, et cetera, and any follow-up information. I think coming up with a reliable method of communication to get this information to the right person, like I said, typically the DSS regional nurses are that person, is really critical, because otherwise, as I've shown at the bottom, you want to avoid kind of screaming into the void where nobody, you're doing all this good work and nobody knows what you're doing and doesn't know necessarily how to follow up in what's in the child's best interests. So I'm showing the CME information, which you've had in previous slides and we'll show again, as well as the number to claim credit is right here. And I'll leave this up and open it up to questions, comments, concerns.
Thanks, Dr. Wallace. While you were speaking, a couple of questions and comments did come in through the chat box.
Oh, great. Okay.
So perhaps we could start there. Someone mentioned that they see a lot of informal kinship